But I mean, I don't see why any landlord's making profit off rent or off housing, right? If I pay rent to my house, it's for a human right. I'm paying just to maintain that home. I think that should be the basis. So if it has to be a thing where a two-bedroom flat literally is £600 maximum, then it is what it has to be.
600 a month. That's the number that sparked the housing debate. When Green Party's Dylan Law, Hackney's deputy mayor, argued in an interview that rents should be capped at around £600 a month and that landlords should not be profiting from housing. The comments quickly ignited debate about affordability, rents, and the future of private renting. But context matters. That £600 figure was not plucked entirely out of thin air. It was part of a wider conversation around the housing crisis and the cost of living. Dylan Law was comparing average rental costs in the private sector to the approximate monthly rent for a two-bedroom council property in Hackney, a publicly owned housing model. But here's the question. But private renting works very differently. This is a sector where landlords are carrying mortgage debt, repair bills, insurance costs, compliance pressures, and increasing legal complexity. Tax reforms have also hit hard, particularly changes to mortgage interest relief, reshaping whether letting for some remains financially viable at all. Many questioned whether it reflected the economic realities of private renting. And yet, the comment resonated. Because if you are renting privately in London today, the affordability gap is staggering. The housing crisis in Britain is deepening. And this is where the harder question begins. Dylan Law's proposal may be questionable, but the realities behind it are very real. Younger renters have become one of the most visible faces of housing frustration, locked out of ownership, battling rising rents, and often paying extraordinary proportions of their income just to stay housed. But the housing crisis doesn't stop at 20-somethings. The generation that came into adulthood facing soaring rents, stagnant wage growth, expensive transport, student debt, inflation, and house prices that feel less like ambition and more like fantasy. Working couples are delaying life decisions because housing costs consume disposable income. Families are falling into rent arrears when budgets simply stop stretching. Government statutory data for homelessness early 2025. Households living in emergency accommodation is now 22,700. This has doubled in the last decade, from 10,310 in 2015. Nearly half, 46% of London households homeless and in temporary accommodation are stuck in out-of-area accommodation. In Manchester, this figure is over a third, 39%. Single-income households are increasingly vulnerable to even minor financial shocks. Older renters face growing insecurity later in life, and private landlords themselves are operating in a far tougher environment than many political soundbites acknowledge.
And I work in Hackney, and I'm renting in Hackney, and I pay nearly half of my salary on my rent.
I pay around £850.
So I'm in a lucky situation at the moment because there's four of us living in a two-bed. Yeah, two couples. Separate couples, so I'm paying £650 at the moment, which is probably the cheap.
Britain's housing crisis isn't just about not building enough homes. Today's affordability crisis was shaped by a series of political and market decisions that fundamentally changed who provides housing. In 1980, the right to buy transformed housing in Britain. It allowed council tenants to buy their homes, often at significant discounts. But while homes were being sold, councils were heavily restricted from building replacements. So stock fell faster than it was replaced. More than 2 million social homes have been sold since 1980. The next major shift came in 1988. The government wanted to encourage private investment into rented housing. The Housing Act 1988 introduced the assured shorthold tenancy, making private letting more commercially viable. Then, buy-to-let mortgages became widely accessible. The private rented sector grew rapidly, today accounting for around 19% of households in England, more than double its historic share. The private rented sector was never originally designed to function as a substitute for a shrinking social housing system. It was intended as a market tenure, a commercial housing sector, not a welfare safety net. But as affordable housing supply tightened, social house building slowed, waiting lists grew, and home ownership became harder to access. The private rented sector increasingly became the overflow valve, the sticking plaster. Families who might once have expected council housing found themselves renting privately, single professionals delayed buying. Couples stayed renting longer. families with children remained in insecure rented accommodation for years. Low-income households increasingly relied on housing benefit to access homes priced by the market, which brings us back to Dillon law. Supporters of rent controls argue housing is not a normal commodity. If housing is essential to survival, why should it be treated like any other investment? Why should profit sit at the center of something so fundamental? The argument is simple. If rents rise faster than wages, households become trapped, displacement increases, and housing insecurity becomes normalized. That is broadly where the Green Party sits. It has long supported rent controls, stronger tenant protections, and intervention to limit excessive rent inflation. Critics take a very different view. Opponents argue rent controls discourage investment and reduce supply. England has already seen landlords exit due to tax changes and rising interest rates. But Britain may already be moving toward a softer form of rent control. Under the renters' rights reforms, tenants will gain stronger rights to challenge rent increases. This isn't a formal cap, but it is greater market intervention. The statistics tell their own story. Private renting has expanded, rents have outpaced affordability, and social housing is lacking. The reforms provide security, but do not create new housing supply. That means the pressure on the private rented sector remains, and so does the wider housing crisis.